Disney's live-action Snow White isn't just a movie, it's a PR disaster. With its star Rachel Zegler throwing shade at the original classic and CEO Bob Iger scrambling to control the damage, this fairy tale has become a corporate nightmare. Is Zegler Hollywood's next cautionary tale? Or is she just the scapegoat in Disney's latest flop? Buckle up, this story is messier than a poison apple. When Disney first announced a live-action remake of Snow White, the response was, at least on paper, exactly what the studio wanted. Another beloved classic reimagined for a new generation. Another chance to cash in on nostalgia. And with the runaway success of previous remakes like Cinderella and Beauty and the Beast, fans expected magic. After all, this was Snow White, the film that launched the Disney empire, the original princess, the one that started it all. The studio hyped it as a modern fairy tale with fresh flair. Oscar-winning director Mark Webb at the helm. Benj Pasek and Justin Paul, the songwriting duo behind La La Land and The Greatest Showman, brought on to pen new music. And at the center of it all, Rachel Zegler, the breakout star from West Side Story, cast as the iconic princess. A rising talent, a Latina Snow White. Disney was betting big, but the fairy tale glow faded fast. From the moment the casting was announced, the internet lit up, not with applause, but controversy. Some praised the inclusivity. Others called it performative. Snow White isn't white anymore became a headline, a meme, a lightning rod. Critics accused Disney of rewriting stories not to tell new ones, but to check boxes. And then came the plot changes. Early leaks revealed this wasn't the Snow White fans remembered. The evil queen was still there, but the prince? Irrelevant. The kiss? Creepy. The dwarves? Replaced with a group of mysterious bandits. The romantic storyline? Scrapped for a feminist empowerment arc. Snow White, we were told, would no longer be saved by man. She would be a leader, a girl boss, the CEO of her own destiny. But instead of applause, audiences recoiled. The story wasn't just being updated, it was being gutted. For many, it felt like Disney was trying to apologize for the original instead of honoring it. Nostalgia turned sour. People didn't want a new Snow White. They wanted the Snow White, enchanted forests, glass coffins, poisoned apples and all. And what started as excitement quickly curdled into skepticism. Online forums filled with side-eyes. TikToks mocking the new direction went viral. YouTube commentators dubbed it woke white. The message was clear. Something about this remake didn't feel magical. It felt manufactured. The fairy tale was cracking, and the worst was yet to come. When Rachel Zegler first stepped into the spotlight, she was Hollywood's new Cinderella, literally. Plucked from obscurity, she became the lead in Steven Spielberg's West Side Story, beating out 30,000 other hopefuls. She had the voice, the charm, the Disney princess glow. America loves a breakout star, and Rachel fit the narrative perfectly. Bright-eyed, talented, humble. She was a girl next door who made it big. Disney saw a future franchise queen. Casting her as Snow White was supposed to be a slam dunk, a symbol of progress. A young Latina woman taking on the most iconic fairy tale role in film history. But if Zegler was supposed to be the heir to Disney's legacy of grace and gratitude, she didn't get the memo. Because Rachel Zegler didn't just question the original Snow White, she mocked it. In interview after interview, she distanced herself from the 1937 classic like it was radioactive. The original is weird, she said with a shrug. She's not going to be saved by the prince. In another clip, she laughed, as she called the prince a guy who literally stalks her. Her tone wasn't just critical. It was dismissive, smug, as if she was too good for the very story that gave her the spotlight. The internet pounced. Clips from her press tour began spreading like wildfire. TikTok users spliced together her quotes with scenes from the original, calling her ungrateful, arrogant, insufferable. Hashtags like hashtag Not My Snow White and hashtag Woke Hollywood flooded comment sections. On X, formerly Twitter, Zegler became a trending topic for all the wrong reasons. Meme pages dubbed her Snow Snark. Edits painted her as the villain in her own fairy tale. Even fans who once supported her began turning. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. The snide tone. The performative, "I'm not like other princesses" energy. Viewers didn't see a young actress promoting a bold new take. They saw someone biting the hand that fed her, dismissing a film that shaped generations with the same kind of faux wokeness critics were already tired of. And in an era where online narratives spiral fast, Zegler didn't just become a meme. She became a symbol. A stand-in for everything people felt was wrong with modern Hollywood. Reboots that hate the source material, stars who mock tradition, studios that pander but don't understand. Rachel Zegler was cast to bring Snow White into a new era. But instead of magic and grace, she brought mockery and backlash. The fairy tale wasn't just unraveling, it was starting to burn. For a company built on magic, Disney somehow forgot one of its most powerful spells: nostalgia. When the backlash hit Rachel Zegler, it wasn't just a reputation that started to crumble. It was the entire foundation of Disney's live-action Snow White. At first, the studio brushed off the criticism. They'd weathered storms before. Controversy is part of the PR cycle. But this time, something was different. Because the anger wasn't just about casting choices or modern updates. It was personal. Millions of fans didn't just grow up with Snow White. They grew up with Walt Disney's vision. The 1937 film wasn't just a fairy tale. It was the beginning of everything. The first full-length animated feature. The cornerstone of the Disney empire. A film that Walt himself poured his heart into, mortgaging his home to bring it to life. So when the studio rolled out a remake that looked nothing like the original, 7 magical creatures swapped for 7 vaguely diverse background extras, a heroine who sneered at the story's values, and interviews with a lead actress dismissed the film as weird, it didn't feel like progress. It felt like betrayal. Audiences didn't see a bold reimagining. They saw a studio trying to rewrite the past, erasing the charm, the romance, the innocence that defined the original. And in doing so, they weren't just offending fans. They were tarnishing Walt's legacy. And Disney? They weren't ready. Marketing slowed to a crawl. Trailers were conspicuously absent. Press appearances quietly stopped. Behind the scenes, the film's release date was shuffled more than once, with no official reason given. What had once been touted as a tentpole for Disney's new era of inclusivity suddenly became a ghost. Adrift in the studio's schedule, lost in a storm of its own making. It wasn't just bad optics. It was unprecedented silence. For a company that once rolled out princess merchandise a year in advance and wrapped Times Square in promos, Disney's hesitation spoke volumes. They weren't just regrouping. They were panicking. The backlash had grown too loud, too widespread, too damaging to ignore. And for the first time, the House of Mouse looked vulnerable. Because in trying to reimagine a classic, Disney forgot who the story really belonged to: the fans. And those fans were angry. Not because the film was different, but because it felt like Disney no longer respected its own history. And that's when the fairy tale turned into a PR nightmare. When Bob Iger returned to the helm of Disney in late 2022, he was hailed as the savior. The steady hand brought back to fix the chaos left behind by his successor, Bob Chapek. Wall Street cheered, Disney loyalists sighed in relief, and the narrative was clear. Iger was back to restore the magic. But no one told him the kingdom was on fire. By the time the full extent of the Snow White disaster became clear, it wasn't just a PR headache. It was a brand crisis. And for Iger, the man who had once orchestrated Disney's golden age with the acquisitions of Marvel, Pixar, and Lucasfilm, it was a brutal awakening. Internally, the whispers started fast. Reshoots, script revisions, meetings behind closed doors that stretched for hours. Executives scrambling to spin the backlash, debating whether the film could be salvaged or if it needed to be quietly buried. There were reports, never confirmed, but hard to ignore, of furious board members questioning how this remake had ever gotten greenlit in the first place. And looming over it all was one name: Rachel Zegler. At first, she had been the centerpiece, the face of a new, empowered generation of Disney princesses. Young, talented, outspoken. But when the internet turned on her, the studio's posture shifted like clockwork. Slowly, subtly, deliberately, they began to distance themselves. The red carpets dried up. Scheduled interviews disappeared from the press calendar. Zegler's social media comments went unanswered by official Disney accounts. The once promoted bold, fresh take became shadow. Internal sources hinted at a quiet campaign to de-escalate. Executives were reportedly instructed to stop referencing Zegler in external messaging. PR teams shifted focus from the cast to the timeless themes of the story. Merchandising efforts were dialed down. Promotional materials were refocused to spotlight anything but the controversies. And Bob Iger, he did what CEOs do best in times of scandal. He went quiet. He didn't defend the film. He didn't condemn it either. But his silence was loud. In shareholder calls and interviews, he talked about cost-cutting, streaming strategy, franchise synergy. Snow White was conspicuously absent. And when pressed on Disney's public image issues, Iger gave generic lines about listening to audiences and realigning with core values. But behind the scenes, damage control was the priority. Sources claimed there was a moratorium on woke language in future scripts. Studio heads were reevaluating every upcoming live-action remake. The lesson from Snow White wasn't just that nostalgia sells. It was that mishandling it can backfire spectacularly. Worse still, Iger found himself juggling two irreconcilable sides. On one hand, progressive staff and creators who wanted to push the boundaries and modernize the brand. On the other, investors, parents, and lifelong fans who felt betrayed by what they saw as hollow pandering wrapped in corporate virtue signaling. It was no longer just a film that divided people. It was Disney itself. So Iger did what he could. He cleaned house quietly. He greenlit safer, nostalgia-heavy projects. He launched a new wave of conservative-friendly messaging, more family values, less online activism. And behind it all was an unspoken acknowledgement. Snow White would not be the crown jewel they had hoped for. It would be a lesson, a warning, and perhaps most painful for Iger, a reminder that even the most magical brands aren't immune to public backlash, especially when they forget who built the kingdom in the first place. The fans. Rachel Zegler was supposed to be the next big thing. After her breakout role in West Side Story, the industry couldn't get enough of her. She had that rare mix of old-school Broadway vocals and Gen Z relatability, talented, camera-ready, and full of promise. She was cast as the lead in Snow White, secured a major role in The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and appeared poised to be Hollywood's next darling. She was the it girl, until suddenly she wasn't. Because as fast as the spotlight found her, the backlash came even faster. The clips from those Snow White interviews went viral for all the wrong reasons. Her offhand jabs at the original film, calling it weird, joking that the prince was a stalker, brushing off romance as outdated, hit a nerve, especially when layered with a smug delivery that came off, to many, as mocking. It wasn't just the content, it was the tone. And on TikTok, X, and YouTube, that tone spread like wildfire. She became a meme, a punchline, a cultural chew toy. Some dubbed her the anti-princess princess. Others accused her of hypocrisy, happy to cash in on Disney's legacy while simultaneously tearing it down. TikTok edits skewered her with dramatic music and captions like, "How to kill your own movie before it premieres." Comment sections were flooded with cries of ungrateful, entitled, Hollywood elite, and worse. It wasn't just dislike, it was open resentment. And as the storm intensified, even her other projects began to suffer. When The Hunger Games prequel released, audiences noticed a strange chill around her in promotional appearances. She was in the movie, but not of it. The spotlight leaned more toward her co-stars. Interview questions subtly dodged her presence. Red carpet moments felt less about Rachel, more about damage control. She had become, in industry terms, a risk. The numbers didn't lie. Social media sentiment plummeted. Commentators speculated whether she'd been soft blacklisted, not fired, not canceled, but slowly pushed to the edges. Fewer headlines, fewer bookings, fewer doors opening. And that's when the deeper conversation started. Because for all the criticism Zegler faced, another question echoed in the background. Would a man have been treated the same way? Hollywood is notoriously forgiving of difficult men. There's a long history of male stars throwing tantrums, spouting controversial takes, even assaulting crew members, only to be rewarded with bigger roles, Oscar campaigns, and redemption arcs. But when a young woman speaks her mind, especially in a tone that challenges tradition, she gets labeled a diva, a brat, a problem. So was Zegler simply being honest in an industry built on fake smiles? Was she pushing back against a system that tells women to be pretty, quiet, and grateful? Or did she just misread the room? There's a fine line between authenticity and arrogance, between confidence and condescension. And Zegler walked it with no safety net. Some argue she was brave, that she refused to play the perfect princess, that her comments were rooted in feminism, in progress, in demanding better. Others say she lacked tact, disrespected the fans, and turned a golden opportunity into a cautionary tale. Maybe both are true, but what's certain is this. Rachel Zegler is no longer just an actress. She's a case study, a lightning rod, a symbol of the cultural clash between old Hollywood fairy tales and new Hollywood values, and a reminder of how fast the tide can turn when you speak a little too freely in a town that only pretends to love the truth. Let's zoom out, because while Rachel Zegler may have become the face of the Snow White storm, she was never the root of the problem. This isn't just about one princess. This is about the kingdom itself. For the past decade, Disney has leaned hard on a single strategy: revive the classics, modernize them, recast them, repackage nostalgia with a glossy, live-action finish, and rake in billions from parents and kids alike. And at first, it worked. The Jungle Book was a hit. Beauty and the Beast broke records. Aladdin turned skeptical whispers into global box office gold. But then the cracks started to show. By the time The Little Mermaid swam into theaters in 2023, the fatigue had set in. Yes, it made money, but not Disney money. Then came Peter Pan and Wendy, barely a blip. Pinocchio, forgotten as soon as it dropped. And Snow White, before it even hit screens, it was a battlefield. Audiences weren't just bored, they were angry. Angry at the changes. Angry at the tone. Angry that beloved fairy tales were being treated like outdated relics in need of ideological scrubbing. The magic wasn't just fading, it was being replaced with something that felt calculated. Hollow. Focus grouped to death. What Disney didn't anticipate was how fiercely people would cling to these stories, not just as childhood memories, but as cultural touchstones. They didn't just love Snow White because she sang to birds. They loved her because she represented a kind of innocence and fantasy that the real world doesn't offer anymore. And when the studio seemed to mock that, when actors called the originals weird or creepy, when trailers showed nothing resembling the world people remembered, it didn't feel like progress. It felt like betrayal. And no amount of CGI or musical updates could fix that. The term woke became a weapon. Pundits and YouTubers launched full-blown culture war crusades, using Disney as the punching bag. And while some of the criticism was transparently bigoted or bad faith, not all of it was. Many fans, across the political spectrum, weren't upset about diversity. They were upset about disrespect, about stories being rewritten not to enchant, but to check boxes, about creativity being stifled in favor of corporate appeasement. Which brings us back to Zegler. Maybe she wasn't the villain. Maybe she was just the lightning rod, too honest, too candid, and too unfiltered in a machine that thrives on perfect PR. Maybe she said the quiet part out loud, that Disney no longer believes in the magic it once sold. That fairy tales, to them, are just IP to be recycled. In that sense, Zegler wasn't the problem. She was the symptom, the canary in the coal mine, sounding the alarm on a studio that lost sight of what made it special in the first place. A studio trying to modernize magic but forgetting the wonder. A brand chasing virtue points while bleeding out cultural goodwill. Because here's the thing. You can change the dress, diversify the cast, rewrite the plot. But if the heart isn't there, audiences feel it. Kids might not have the words, but they know when something's off. And adults? They don't just want a remake. They want a reason to believe again. Right now, Disney is caught in a paradox, trying to be everything to everyone and ending up satisfying no one. The fairy tale formula that once felt timeless now feels tired. So maybe the question isn't, why did Snow White flop? Maybe the question is, what does Disney even stand for anymore? Because if the answer is just IP, algorithms, and controversy control, then the magic really is gone. Once upon a time, Disney was untouchable. It was more than a brand. It was a feeling, a promise. A castle in the clouds built on laughter, dreams, and pixie dust. When you saw that shimmering blue logo, you didn't question it. You trusted it. It meant family, fantasy, and stories that stood the test of time. But now, that crown feels cursed. Because in trying to modernize its myths, Disney has done something it never used to do. It stumbled. Not financially, not yet, but culturally, emotionally. It lost the benefit of the doubt. And in Hollywood, that's more dangerous than any box office flop. Snow White was never just a movie. It was the remake of the remake, the one that started it all. The first Disney princess, the original jewel in the studio's crown. And the live-action version should have been a victory lap, a tribute, a love letter. Instead, it became a cautionary tale. One part misguided reinvention, one part PR disaster, and one part identity crisis wrapped in a pretty dress that nobody wanted to wear. The fallout left Rachel Zegler scorched. Once hailed as a rising star, now walking through the smoke of online hate, media skepticism, and tepid industry support. Will she recover? Maybe. She's still young, still talented, still backed by some major names. And if Hollywood loves anything more than a starlet, it's a redemption arc. But the damage is real. Zegler's name is now synonymous with a kind of cultural dissonance, a generational rift between legacy and progress, reverence and reinvention. She became the lightning rod, but she wasn't the only one struck. Disney took a hit too, a big one, because Snow White wasn't just a PR misstep, it was a signal flare, a warning that the era of automatic loyalty is over, that even the Mouse House can't coast on nostalgia if it's not paired with care, that audiences, especially fans of the classics, won't accept change unless it's grounded in love for what came before. You can't just slap on modern values and call it evolution. You have to understand the soul of the story. And that's what Disney forgot. They treated Snow White like an outdated artifact to be fixed. But fairy tales aren't broken. They're timeless. They evolve through spirit, not scorn. Through reinterpretation, not mockery. And when the people telling those stories seem to hate the originals, audiences notice. They feel it. They reject it. So now, Disney faces a choice. Double down and risk alienating more of its core fanbase? Or pause, reflect, and remember what made it beloved in the first place. Because if Snow White taught us anything, it's that legacy isn't a liability unless you treat it like one. The remake may eventually release, may even make a modest splash at the box office. But the damage is done. Its story won't be remembered for songs or costumes or even performances. It'll be remembered as the film that turned Disney's own magic against itself. As for Zegler, only time will tell. She could rise again, older, wiser, with a better team and a media strategy that doesn't make headlines for the wrong reasons. Or she could fade quietly, a talented actress who flew too close to the sun, caught between her ideals and a system that demands silence in exchange for stardom. But either way, one thing is certain. This version of Snow White won't be remembered as the fairest of them all. It'll be remembered as the most infamous. A cultural flashpoint. A moment when Disney cracked, a princess stumbled, and the whole world watched a fairy tale fall apart in real time. And that, more than any poisoned apple or broken spell, is the real curse of the crown.